My name is Michael Richardson, and I spent 26 years working in intelligence analysis for various agencies within the United States government, primarily focused on foreign intelligence gathering and analysis related to advanced aerospace programs. I held top-secret clearance with special compartmentalized access that allowed me to review intelligence from human sources embedded in foreign governments and military establishments. In 2019, I was assigned to a special analysis team tasked with evaluating intelligence reports concerning China's knowledge and research into what we carefully termed non-human intelligence, avoiding the loaded terminology of aliens or extraterrestrials. What I discovered during that assignment fundamentally changed my understanding of the global power dynamics related to this subject and revealed why certain information has been systematically buried by multiple governments working in unusual coordination despite their geopolitical rivalries in virtually every other domain. The intelligence that triggered our team's formation came from a highly placed source within the Chinese Academy of Sciences, who had been providing reliable information to Western intelligence for over a decade. This source, whom I'll call Dr. Chen for protection, despite their real identity being far more complex, had access to classified research programs that the Chinese government operated completely separate from their public scientific establishment. According to Dr. Chen's reports, the Chinese had been conducting systematic research into non-human intelligence since at least the early 1970s, roughly the same timeline as similar programs in the United States and Soviet Union, though their approach and findings differed in significant ways that made their research uniquely valuable and uniquely concerning to Western intelligence analysts. What made the Chinese research particularly interesting was their philosophical and methodological approach, which integrated traditional Chinese concepts about consciousness and reality with modern scientific investigation in ways that Western programs had dismissed as unscientific mysticism. While American and Soviet research focused primarily on recovered materials and technology, trying to reverse engineer physical artifacts to gain military and technological advantage, the Chinese program had dedicated significant resources to what they called consciousness interface research. They operated from a theoretical framework that consciousness might be the primary interface for contact with non-human intelligence rather than radio signals or physical artifacts, and they had apparently made progress that Western programs hadn't achieved because we'd never seriously explored that direction. Dr. Chen's reports described a facility in a remote region of Qinghai province buried deep within mountain systems that made satellite surveillance nearly impossible and ground access extremely restricted even for most Chinese military personnel. This facility, designated by Dr. Chen as Site 17, though whether that was official nomenclature or their own designation remained unclear, housed what was described as a meditation and consciousness research center, staffed by individuals selected for what the Chinese termed high sensitivity to non-local consciousness phenomena. These weren't typical scientists in the Western sense, but rather individuals who had demonstrated through rigorous testing the ability to access altered states of consciousness reliably and report consistent experiences that could be verified across multiple test subjects. The research protocol at Site 17, according to Dr. Chen's detailed reports, involved training these sensitive individuals in specific meditation and consciousness alteration techniques derived from Tibetan Buddhist practices, Taoist internal alchemy, and more recent discoveries about neurofeedback and brainwave entrainment. Once trained to achieve deep altered states consistently, these individuals would be tasked with what was described as reaching out into non-local consciousness space, essentially attempting to make contact with non-human intelligence through consciousness rather than through physical means. The theoretical basis was that if non-human intelligence existed at technological levels far beyond human capability, they would likely have developed consciousness-based communication that transcended the limitations of electromagnetic signals and physical distance that constrained human communication technology.
What Dr. Chen reported next was the part that got serious attention at the highest levels of American intelligence and ultimately led to the burial of this entire subject. According to their access to classified reports within the Chinese program, the consciousness researchers at Site 17 had succeeded in establishing what they characterized as reliable contact with non-human intelligence beginning in the early 2000s. The contact wasn't through physical craft or recovered artifacts, but through direct consciousness-to-consciousness communication during deep meditative states that multiple researchers could access and verify independently. The beings they made contact with, described in the reports as existing in what might be called higher dimensions or non-physical reality, communicated information about their nature, their interest in humanity, and most significantly, about the structure of reality itself that fundamentally challenged materialist scientific assumptions. The intelligence that the Chinese researchers received through these consciousness contacts, if genuine and not elaborate self-deception or deliberate disinformation, suggested that physical reality as understood by current human science was a subset of a much larger consciousness-based reality. The non-human intelligences described themselves not as extraterrestrials in the science fiction sense of biological beings from other planets, though some might inhabit physical form, but rather as consciousness that existed primarily in non-physical dimensions and could interface with physical reality under specific conditions. They claimed to have been aware of and occasionally interacting with human consciousness throughout our history, that many religious and mystical experiences were actually genuine contact with their realm, and that humanity was approaching a critical threshold where broader contact would become possible if we developed the consciousness capabilities and philosophical maturity to handle it productively. Most disturbing from an intelligence perspective was what these entities reportedly communicated about human governments and their handling of the non-human intelligence subject. According to Dr. Chen's reports of the Chinese research findings, the non-human intelligences were well aware that multiple governments had recovered physical artifacts and even biological specimens from crashed craft over the decades. They indicated that these crashes weren't accidents, but rather deliberate provisions of technology samples to help stimulate human technological development while maintaining plausible deniability about direct contact. But they expressed concern that governments had focused exclusively on the material technology while ignoring the consciousness aspects, and that this imbalanced approach was leading humanity toward technological capability without corresponding wisdom, a dangerous combination that had destroyed other developing civilizations. The entities allegedly communicated that they had protocols against direct, open contact with developing civilizations like humanity because such contact typically caused cultural disruption and dependency rather than organic development. Instead, they operated through what might be called a monitoring and gentle guidance approach, occasionally providing technology nudges through crashes or sightings, communicating more directly with individuals who achieved certain consciousness states through meditation or spontaneous mystical experience, and essentially waiting for humanity to develop both technological capability and consciousness maturity sufficient to join what they described as a community of spacefaring conscious civilizations. We were being tested, essentially, and how we handled the current period would determine whether we graduated to broader contact or destroyed ourselves before achieving that milestone. If you've ever questioned whether consciousness might be more fundamental than we've been taught, share your thoughts in the comments below.
What made intelligence agencies take this seriously, despite its seemingly metaphysical nature, was that the Chinese had apparently achieved measurable results that couldn't be easily dismissed as delusion or fantasy. Dr. Chen reported that information received through the Consciousness Contact Protocol had been verified in ways that eliminated chance as explanation. The entities had provided specific technical information about physics and material science that Chinese researchers subsequently confirmed through conventional experimentation, information that wasn't available in existing human scientific literature and that required sophisticated understanding of advanced concepts.
They had provided accurate predictions about geophysical events, solar activity, and even specific political developments that occurred months after the predictions were recorded. And most convincingly, multiple independent researchers at Site 17 reported receiving identical complex information during separate sessions, a statistical impossibility if they were just generating content from their own subconscious minds. The Chinese government's response to these findings, according to Dr. Chen, was complex and ultimately led to significant policy shifts that Western intelligence initially misinterpreted. China began scaling back certain military aerospace programs that had focused on developing advanced weapon systems, redirecting resources toward what were described as consciousness research and peaceful space exploration technologies. They quietly shifted their stance in certain international forums, becoming advocates for global cooperation on issues that they previously approached competitively. And they began developing educational and cultural programs focused on teaching meditation and consciousness development to broader populations, initiatives that Western observers noted but interpreted as soft power cultural influence operations rather than recognition of consciousness as strategically important. Most significantly, Dr. Chen reported that China had attempted to share some of their findings with the United States through back channels, proposing joint research programs that would combine American technological capabilities with Chinese consciousness research approaches. These overtures were made at high levels during the Obama and Trump administrations, carefully worded to avoid ridicule, but clear enough in their implications that they should have been taken seriously. According to Dr. Chen's understanding, based on their access to Chinese strategic discussions, the proposals were rejected by the United States not because we doubted the findings, but because accepting them would have required acknowledging that China had made significant progress in an area we had dismissed as unscientific, and because the implications of the research threatened too many established interests and belief systems within the American security and scientific establishments. The decision to bury this intelligence rather than act on it came from the highest levels of the American national security apparatus, according to what I witnessed during my time on the analysis team. We produced detailed reports confirming that Dr. Chen was a reliable source, that the Chinese research appeared genuine rather than disinformation, and that the implications were significant enough to warrant serious investigation and potential policy shifts. But our reports were progressively restricted to smaller audiences, classified at higher levels, and ultimately seemed to disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The reasoning, never stated explicitly but clear from context, was that acknowledging consciousness as primary rather than emergent, that non-human intelligence communicated through consciousness rather than physical craft, and that China had made breakthroughs we hadn't, would undermine too many pillars of the existing power structure.
The scientific establishment would have to acknowledge that their materialist assumptions had led them to ignore an entire dimension of reality that other cultures and traditions had been exploring for millennia. The religious establishments would have to reconcile their doctrines with the existence of non-human intelligences that didn't fit into their theological frameworks. The military-industrial complex would have to shift from weapons development toward consciousness development, a transition that threatened trillion-dollar industries and career paths built around conventional warfare concepts. And perhaps most threatening, acknowledging that consciousness was fundamental rather than emergent, that it continued beyond physical death, and that reality was far stranger than materialist science suggested, would empower individuals in ways that threatened institutional control. People who understood they were eternal consciousness temporarily incarnated in physical form were much harder to manipulate through fear and material incentives than people who believed they were finite biological machines that ceased at death. I saw this dynamic play out repeatedly during my years analyzing the Chinese intelligence.
Every few months, new reports would come from Dr. Chen or other sources confirming and expanding on the consciousness research findings. We would dutifully analyze and report, always reaching the same conclusion that this deserved serious attention and investigation. And every time, the response would be classification, restriction, and burial. The pattern became so consistent that I eventually understood it wasn't bureaucratic incompetence, but rather deliberate policy. The decision had been made at levels above my clearance that this information was too disruptive to existing systems to be acknowledged or acted upon, regardless of its validity or importance. We were going to continue treating the non-human intelligence question as purely physical and technological, continue the secrecy and denial around recovered artifacts, and completely ignore the consciousness dimensions that the Chinese research suggested were actually primary. The frustration within our analysis team was palpable. We were intelligence professionals who had dedicated careers to providing accurate information for policymakers, and we were watching critical intelligence being systematically ignored for what appeared to be political and institutional protection rather than national security reasons. Several team members requested transfers or resigned in protest, though none of us could speak publicly about what we were protesting without violating security oaths. I stayed longer than most, perhaps out of stubbornness, or maybe hoping that eventually the right people would pay attention. But by 2021, I realized nothing was going to change within the system and began planning my own exit. What finally convinced me to leave and eventually speak out, despite the legal risks, was learning about parallel developments in other countries that confirmed the Chinese findings independently. Through intelligence channels, I learned that research programs in Russia, Brazil, and India had also explored consciousness-based approaches to non-human intelligence contact, and all reported similar results to what the Chinese had found. Russian researchers working from completely different theoretical frameworks and using different methodologies had achieved comparable contact through altered consciousness states and received similar information about reality being consciousness-based rather than purely material. Brazilian researchers working with indigenous shamanic traditions had documented experiences that aligned remarkably well with what Chinese meditation practitioners reported. Indian researchers working from yogic and Vedic frameworks found the same patterns. The global consistency of these findings across different cultures, methodologies, and political systems suggested they were discovering genuine aspects of reality rather than generating culturally specific fantasies. When independent research programs operating under completely different assumptions and using completely different methods all converge on similar conclusions, that's typically considered strong evidence in any other scientific domain. But in this case, the consistency was treated as reason for more aggressive suppression rather than serious investigation. The concern seemed to be that if this information became public, the implications would be so destabilizing that social and institutional structures might not survive the transition.
I retired from government service in late 2021, taking early retirement at 54 years old, despite loving the work and having every intention of continuing for another decade. But I couldn't continue participating in what I had come to see as deliberate suppression of transformative information that humanity deserved to know. The non-human intelligence question wasn't primarily about crashed saucers and reverse-engineered technology, though that aspect was real. It was fundamentally about consciousness, about reality being far stranger and more magnificent than materialist science had led us to believe, and about humanity being on the verge of a transition that would change everything about how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos. Dr. Chen, my primary source for the Chinese intelligence, went silent in early 2022. Their last communication indicated they were being investigated by Chinese security services and might not be able to maintain contact. I don't know if they were arrested, reassigned, or simply decided the risk was too high to continue sharing classified information. But the reports they provided over more than a decade remain in classified archives, documented evidence that China had made extraordinary progress in understanding non-human intelligence through consciousness research, had attempted to share that information for the benefit of all humanity, and had been essentially ignored by Western governments that preferred to maintain existing power structures rather than confront transformative truth with populations. The burial of this intelligence wasn't unique to the United States. According to what I learned through various channels, similar suppression was occurring globally. The Chinese themselves, despite their breakthroughs, maintained strict secrecy around Site-17 and related programs, sharing information only selectively with other governments through back channels rather than making public announcements. Russia kept their consciousness research classified and separate even from most of their own government and scientific establishment. The pattern was global coordination to keep consciousness-based contact and understanding buried, even as governments competed intensely in virtually every other domain. The only explanation that made sense was that this information threatened power structures globally, not just in any single nation, and that there was informal agreement across geopolitical rivals that maintaining existing control structures was more important than sharing transformative truth with populations. What keeps me awake at night is wondering how many other crucial insights about reality are being similarly buried because they threaten existing institutions and belief systems. If something is potentially transformative as consciousness-based reality and contact with non-human intelligence can be systematically suppressed despite consistent evidence from multiple independent sources, what else might we be missing? How many scientific breakthroughs have been classified or dismissed because they didn't fit materialist assumptions? How many individuals with genuine mystical or contact experiences have been ridiculed or institutionalized rather than studied seriously? How much wisdom from ancient traditions has been dismissed as primitive superstition rather than recognized as knowledge gained through different methodologies than Western science employs? The Chinese research that I analyzed for years suggested that reality operates very differently from what mainstream science teaches. Consciousness appears to be fundamental rather than emergent, existing independent of physical brains and capable of accessing information and connecting with other consciousness across distances that should be impossible if materialism were correct. Non-human intelligence exists and has been interacting with humanity throughout history, not primarily through physical craft, but through consciousness-to-consciousness contact that religious and mystical traditions have been documenting for millennia. The physical universe is nested within larger consciousness-based reality, and what we call death is transition to different state of existence rather than cessation. These aren't fringe beliefs or wishful thinking, but rather conclusions supported by rigorous research programs conducted by one of the world's most technologically advanced nations using methodologies that produced verifiable results.